Good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you again, and I'm really love being with you, and even in this, maybe even especially in this unique way. There's something about Zoom that many of us I know are hate, but there's also something about it that is really kind of neat. For example, being able to bring people from all across the country to join us in today's service. So it's good to be with you. So I start today's sermon with words from Ijoma Olua, and she's the author of "So You Want to Talk About Race." And she says the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's the only way forward. You know, as the racialized deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and others have drawn national attention and protest, I think many of us rightfully are asking ourselves what we can do, how we can become more anti-racist and make our society more anti-racist. And I think it's really important for us to realize that racism and anti-racism, becoming less racist and more racist, is a process. I'm reminded of words from John Lewis: "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime." It is the struggle of a lifetime. Many of us, maybe all of us, will not see the end of racism in our society when our lives come to an end. So our commitment to anti-racism becomes a commitment of the moment, yes, absolutely, but also a commitment of a lifetime and a commitment of generations. Anti-racism is a journey. It is a process. It is an evolution, both individually and collectively. And so our lives can contribute to that process, both in our own transformation day by day and in the transformation of our society. None of us are all racist or anti-racist. Each of us can make racist choices, support racist ideas, or uphold racist policies, and make anti-racist choices, support anti-racist ideas, and uphold anti-racist policies. At the core of anti-racist work is racial equity. Do the choices we make, the ideas we support, the power we exhibit, and the ways that we live increase or diminish racial equity? And I have been reflecting on my own journey with racism and anti-racism, taking note of different movements and measures and times with race. And I want to share some of that journey with you. And I'm going to center, there's a couple major learnings. There's three major learnings that I want to share with you. And I'm going to center each of those with quotes from anti-racist activists and authors. The first quote comes from Austin Channing Brown in her book, "I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness." And she wrote, "When you believe niceness disproves the presence of racism, it's easy to start believing bigotry is rare, and that the label racist should be applied only to mean-spirited, intentional acts of discrimination. The problem with this framework, besides being a gross misunderstanding of how racism operates in systems and structures enabled by nice people, is that it obligates me to be nice in return, rather than truthful." And the other quote comes from Robin DiAngelo in her book, White Fragility. And she writes, "When we try to talk openly and honestly about race, white fragility quickly emerges, as we are so often met with silence, defensiveness, argumentation, certitude, and other forms of pushback. These are not natural responses. They are social forces that prevent us from attaining the racial knowledge we need to engage more productively. And they function powerfully to hold the racial hierarchy in place. My first engagement with active anti-racist education was in my first year of college, about 30 years ago now. The civil rights movement had fascinated me up to that point, and I had already done some social justice work in my life, mostly poverty and environmentalism, but human rights was a real kind of passion for me also. And I saw this extracurricular class offered at my college called Oppression. And I applied to get in that class, and I was accepted. And the class was a fairly diverse group, and it was the first time in my life when I, as the straight white middle class man, was by myself. I was the sole person who fit into that demographic in that space. In the class, I fit into every group that held power. And I took this hard. I struggled with this. I started to feel like, in the process of this, I started to feel like the enemy. And I honestly, I struggled against that, and in some ways fought back against it. I centered myself and my own needs in that conversation, in that dialogue, in that class. And I really needed to be liked. I needed to be seen as the same rather than less than. And I needed to convey what I now know to be a racist, oppressionist idea, that we all can be equally oppressive, that my positions of power didn't matter, and that we could all be prejudiced. And voicing that got me into trouble in this group and in this work. And I struggled in the work most with the definition of racism as power plus prejudice, because it felt like we were changing the definition of the word, and that it left me out as someone who could be prejudiced against. And I didn't want to see that racism was deeper than interpersonal relationships. I needed to be seen as the good guy, and I struggled with anything that I experienced as counter to that. And that was a painful lesson. Not one that I learned immediately, but it was a lesson I did learn eventually, that we can't understand any oppression without considering power, acknowledging power, and owning who has more of that power, and recognizing that such power obligates me and us to use it for change. It took a lot of personal work to set my ego aside, to set my need to be good aside, so I could actually listen and learn without taking what I heard personally, and trying to defend myself from other people's experience of racism and oppression. A second learning. James Baldwin tells us, if one really wishes to know how justice is administered in a country, one does not question the policemen, the lawyers, the judges, or the protected members of the middle class. One goes to the unprotected, those precisely who need the law's protection the most, and listens to their testimony. Ask any Mexican, any Puerto Rican, any Black man, any poor person. Ask the wretched how they fare in the halls of justice, and then you will know not whether or not the country is just, but whether or not it has any love for justice or any concept of it. And James Cone, in his book, Black Theology and Black Power, wrote, since whites do not know the extent of Black suffering, they can only speak from their own perspective, which they call reason. Some of you may recall the horrible Isla Vista shootings back in 2014, a horrible incident. And following those killings and the release of the misogynistic ramblings of the killer, the Me Too movement took off. It kind of exploded online. where thousands, maybe millions of women wrote on social media their experiences of sexual harassment and abuse, along with the hashtag #MeToo. And something struck me in that whole conversation. Something hit me, which should have been obvious, but I finally kind of really heard it in that. And I learned in a new way how important it is to step out of my own perspective and consider another person's point of view. From the dialogue that emerged from the Isla Vista shootings, I learned that to some degree or another, all women have experienced sexual harassment, abuse, or worse in their lives, and that sexual harassment for many is a daily threat and experience, that women live with this all the time in a way that I obviously don't. And that I need to take that experience of women seriously, not ignore it or dismiss it, or simply because it is not my experience. And this may seem to many of you like a no duh moment, but this was an awakening moment for me to kind of learn to hear all of those stories and to take them in and to trust them. And I feel and felt the same thing emerging around that time that came out of many of the protests that emerged around that time also, against the death of Black Americans by police officers. And that while I, as a white person, feel very little fear or concern with police officers, people of color, especially African Americans, experience acts of prejudice and racism all the time. So for me to understand for a moment, I have to step out of my side of my perspective and take in the possibility of another reality that is different from my own. I have to consider that people experience the world differently from me. And both in the cases of sexism and racism and other oppressions, I have to step out of my narrow band of understanding and appreciate, and more importantly, trust the validity of another point of view. It's a man's privilege to not see the sexism of a woman's daily existence. And it is a white person's privilege to not see the racism of a person of color's daily existence. It is an act of oppression, then, to deny that what's being shared is true. The core of this was to realize that my perspective is not all perspectives, and I am obligated to listen to experiences of misogyny, racism, and oppression from a place of trust. I am obligated to listen from a place of trust when I hear those stories. Another quote from James Combs' Black Theology and Black Power, he wrote, "The liberal is one who sees both sides of the issue and shies away from extremism in any form. He wants to change the heart of the racist without ceasing to be his friend. He wants progress without conflict. Therefore, when he sees Blacks engaging in civil disobedience and demanding freedom now, he is disturbed. Black people know who the enemy is, and they are forcing the liberal to take sides. But the liberal wants to be a friend, that is, enjoy the rights and privileges pertaining to whiteness, and also work for in the time that he wrote, for the Negro, from the time when he wrote this. He wants change without risk. He wants victory without blood." And then from Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, "I must confess that over the last few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods,' who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season." Both of these quotes continue to haunt me. When I was involved in the protests a year ago that some of you are aware of against the presence of white supremacists here in our community's farmers market, protests that eventually led to my arrest, I wanted to quit those protests many times. I struggled with other activists. I struggled with other white people, and I've really shared this in my talks about that work. But in that process, I put my employment at great risk. I lost donors for the nonprofit I work for, and almost lost two of our largest donors, and almost split the board of my organization. I lost grant funding and damaged my relationships with the mayor, the police chief, and the head of the parks department, all people I have to work with regularly. People can be perspective. Even in my own work, working with people in poverty, working with people who are homeless, working with people who are struggling with hunger and other challenges of poverty, even in that work, there was a level of whiteness that led to removing of support of that work because of disturbing the status quo and disturbing and challenging um, structures that upheld racism in our community. And I find myself consistently challenged by that reality, the tension between standing up for what's right and the threat of loss of relationships, loss of livelihood, loss of power. And I think it's really important to understand that these losses are under threat anytime that any of us stand up against structures of power in our society. And they're not trivial losses. We will not always, or even maybe often, be rewarded for standing against oppression. We can celebrate John Lewis's words, his call to get into good trouble, necessary trouble. And I've seen many people in our community lift those words up who are actively against the protests in the market. And we can lift those words up, but we at the same time not deeply analyze that some will punish you for that trouble. Even people you consider friends, even people you consider on the same side politically or religiously. So perhaps the greatest lesson of all that I've learned in anti-racist work is and encountering racism in my own self, is do all you can to keep going. There will be setbacks, there will be struggles, there will be times when you fall short. Keep going. John Lewis calls us to that. He reminds us this struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Shalom, amen, and blessed be.